Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're starting a brand new book, and it is The Returning by Christine Hinwood. This is a fantasy that takes place just after a war has ended. And I won't say too much more, but it's definitely a world you could get lost in. Also, this book was a Prince Honor Book. The Prince is an award for the best in young adult books. If you want to know a little bit more of a preview, I will put the full description down below. Okay, I'm going to try and show you the map as best as I can on camera so you can have an idea of where the places are. Snail hunt. Pin and Cam were grinding wheat for flour when Da came in, his arms full of lettuces. Ayo! Da straightened his arms and the lettuces tumbled onto the table. Do you look at this? Pin looked. Ew! And moved back. The outer leaves were full of holes. When Da peeled them back, inside were tiny baby snails, smaller than Pin's little fingernail. Look at the mess they've made! The lettuces, thought Pin, looked like tattered green lace. You ought to see it out there. It's a plague of them. Even the thrushes cannot keep up. No one minds a bit of meat to their greens, but we'll have no greens left for market soon, and then how will we pay the new lord's taxes? Well, said Ma'am, I have a crock of beer put by, that'll do, and there have always been taxes, new lord or old. Da picked the snails off the lettuces and threw them out the door for the birds. Torches we'll need, as there's no moon. Who will help me? The twins pushed up to Da's side. Can I? Said Edward. Huger jostled him. Can we? Aye, if you do as you're told. In the doorway, Da stopped and tweaked Pin's bare toes. Make certain you're wearing your pattens after tea. Pin looked at her feet. Pattens were for mud and snow, to keep your shoes dry, not for mid-spring. Why, Da? Da put his finger alongside his nose and closed one eye. Ma'am, why have I to wear my pattens tonight? You'll see, said Ma'am. Pin sat on the doorstep where the sun nosed into the cottage and thought of a dress of green lettuce lace, of what it would be like to have your house on your back. Stop sulking, said Ma'am after a time. I wasn't. Sitting there with a face on you to turn the milk. She's not sulking, she's thinking, said Cam. Pin wondered how he knew. Cam had gone to war when Pin was very small, and it was as if she'd never met him. Not until after the war had ended and he'd come riding in with the warm spring winds, on his fine, tall horse, with his sword and his spear and his stories of the north. He picked Pin up and flung her into the air, caught her between his arm and his side. Oof, you are getting heavy. Thin as a pin my backside, plump as a pin. Pin screeched with laughter. When Cam sat down, she climbed into his lap. Well, said Ma'am, how's that? She never likes to be held. Cam jogged her up and down. Does she not? He tipped his head sideways and down and looked into her face, his own all funny and upside down. The new Lord of Dornlannet, he does have a snail keep, little Pin sister. Pin felt her skin lift up in goosebumps. On an island, it's in a lake, this island, and the lake in the garden, and the garden in the castle so fine, so as the snails cannot escape, and he does feed them on milk and grain and grape juice, until they grow too fat to get back into their shells. Pin's stomach felt funny. Spiders were fine, and beetles, but snails and slugs and all those wet worming things, they gave Pin shivers down her back. Then, do you know what he does? No. His cooks do fry them up and serve them to the Lord. Leave be, said Ma'am. Do you want her sick all over you? Sick, said her stranger brother, his laughter rocking Pin forward and back. The Lord he does think them a great delicacy. Well, they've their own ways, those uplanders. Aye, ma'am, they do. Then, said Ma'am, do you think to be all afternoon milling a bit of grain? Cam winked at Pin, hefted the millstone in his hand. You feed, I'll grind. Pin trickled grain through the bottom of her fist, and Cam worked the stone in circles. How did you know that I was only thinking? And not sulking? Ma'am did used to say it to me, too. Cam ground slowly, using his knees to steady the bowl. You grind faster now. Pin fed more grain for him to mill. I'm learning how to make the left hand do for the right. Pin had heard people call Cam a cripple, but a cripple couldn't mill wheat, couldn't lift Pin into the air. It's people who have to learn you with your one arm doing for both. Clever, Pin. Why do I have to wear my pattens after tea? Ah, said Cam, and just as Da had done, he winked. The wheat was milled, and Ma'am had turned it into dough that now sat rising by the fire. Cam paced out the 4 walls of the cot, picking things up, putting them down again. I'll bother Da for something to do. Do that, said Ma'am. Glad to see the back of me. Cam spoke in that sort of loud whisper that was meant to be heard. Get on with you. Ma'am flapped her hands at Cam as he went out the door. Pin trotted after him, trotted because Cam walked very fast, from cot to shed to terrace. Dad was plowing the lower terrace, hot and heavy work. He stopped when he saw them and leaned on the plow. You've a very little shadow for such a great strong fellow. Da spoke to Cam, but he winked at Pin. Cam turned, and Pin ran to stay behind him. I've come to help. I don't need help, lad. Da's face was red and sweat shiny, but I could do with a drink. There, Pin Little, in the shade of the hedge. Pin found the flask and lugged it over to Da. If you won't have my help, said Cam, at least hitch the gray to the plow. Da shook his head. Not that beast, a lord's horse, that. And I, a Kayforl farmer's son. Ah, you rest, you've done enough. Cam kicked at the ground with the toe of his boot. I've done nothing since I did come home. You fought, you've done enough. Enough for who? For what? To rot the rest of my days? Pin trailed Cam back up the hill. She wasn't ready for him, and he whirled about and picked her up. Never caught my own shadow before. He carried her upside down through the cot door and set her on the floor by the hearth. I did find a strange-looking sack of flour out there, ma'am. Aye, strange indeed, Ma'am was laughing, full of weevils from the way it's wriggling. Pin was squirming about on the floor. I'm off to the tavern. Cam unwound Pin's fingers from his ankle. So my shadow stays here. Ma'am halted in her work and just looked at Cam. At least I've something I can do there. Cam blew her a kiss and left. Snail hunt tonight, said Da over tea. Da? Pin asked. Where is Cam? Ow! Edward had kicked her under the table. Huger tipped his head back in mind, pouring a drink down his throat. Glug, glug! He wobbled his head about and crossed his eyes. Edward shoved at him. Get off! Da cuffed them both about the ears. Not fair, said Huger, but in a whisper. It isn't me at the tavern. Ma'am was looking knives at him, and that squashed Huger's impudence. I come home from the fighting, and for what? Pin jumped. There was Cam, leaning in the doorway. Maybe he had been to the tavern, but his eyes weren't crossed. Pin looked closely. More slaughter, Cam grinned. Huger whacked the flat of his hand on the table. Splat! It's great! He looked at Pin and ground the heel of his palm against the wood. Ew, it's squishing between my fingers. Near, snail guts. He reached across the table, fingers wiggling. Slapping his hands away, Pin squealed. Do you have your pattens on, Pin? I da, but why? Tell her, Huger. Squish them snails. Pin thought of her nice, clean pattens, the steel black and shining and the wood scrubbed pale. Da, she said, I do not want to. Pfft, said Da. No better weapon against snails than a small girl in pattens. But it is them or us, and I did plant those lettuces. They do be mine, they and the barter they get us at market. Right. Cam opened the door wide behind him and bowed. Let's hunt. Ma got the crock of beer. Do not waste it on pests, said Cam. I'll be rid of it for you if that is what you are wanting. She took the saucers from under the teacups, and Da held the torches in the fire until they took and burned. He gave them to the twins to hold. Don't you two set yourselves afire. Outside, the sky was big, black at the edges where it touched the earth, starlight bleached in the middle. The house sat on the side of the hill, both house and hill round and low and dumpy. In the daylight, you could see the little lumpen hillocks that lifted all across the valley, each with its round cot and terraces, all of them together making up the village of Kayforl. But now only the lamps showed, like yellow, earthbound stars. Down on the terraces of the holding, the fruit trees lifted their leafy fingers high and brushed them, hissing together. Shadows hung under the boughs, but they would not pounce tonight, not with Cam here, and Da and Mam and the boys with the torches. Pin walked at Mam's side, her pattens clumping loud on the ground. It was fun being scared when everyone was out there, not like it was going to the outhouse on her own. Huger and Edward were already in among the lettuces, throwing snails on the ground and squashing them. Their feet went stomp, 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 and the snails made small wet cracks and were no more. Mam was scooping shallow holes in the ground and setting the saucers in them, and Cam and Da went around filling each one with beer. One for me, said Cam and swigged from the bottle. One for thee. He held the crock out to Da. For a moment Da stood and glared at Cam. Then he took the crock. Did you not wet your whistle enough earlier? Bah! By all the great gods, you're a thorny one. What would you know about it, old man? Shaking his head, Da filled a saucer with beer. Cam shrugged. And one for they. Then they moved to the next saucer to do it again, and the next, and the next. Pin followed them, watching it all under the uneven torchlight. Snails like beer near as much as your brother, said Da at length. Best way to lure them. Shh! Mam's voice came out of the dark. Leave him be. You listen to my mam, said Cam. Leave me be. Cam took Pin riding on his shoulders, under the trees and around. The Uplanders, they took the old Lord of Dornlanet's castle, and old Lord Garaman himself, like this, covered both the north and south approaches, and stormed it. We'd only half the garrison there, so we had to run up and down that wall. He climbed up on the orchard wall and trotted the length of it, Pin jouncing like a rag doll. And down and up it, putting arrows into them. Those at the front, they gave back. But there were always more of them, and they kept coming. They did take the castle, didn't they, Cam? Pin knew the story, for Cam never stopped telling it. That they did, and all of us who lived. The Uplanders were numerous as those snails, and they just climbed over the wall, yelling to stop the heart in you. He jumped down the far side of the orchard wall and ran howling across the field. That is when they cut off your arm, cried Pin. Aye. They did come over the wall and take you prisoner. Her brother stopped. Yet they did not. That is what I cannot figure, he said, his left hand warm on her ankle. Healed me, cared for me, and I their enemy, and they mine. But why? Why? Pin was bored with lords and war. She took a hank of Cam's long hair in each hand. Get up! She snapped the hair reins, and Cam, horse brother, galloped back to the others, bucking and snorting like the veriest wild, unbroken colt. In among the vegetables, Mam was weeding, quick and quiet, for all that it was dark. She was bent and round as the cottage. Crouching, Da watched his saucers of beer. Do you see any, Da? Pin came and leaned against him. You look, Pin girl. She bent down and looked close. The saucers were full of drunk, drowning snails. Poor things, said Cam. Pin made a face and retreated to the fruit trees. Under their heavy shadows, she stamped around as she had seen Huger and Edward do, until the smell of the bruised grass was thick in the air. When the thought came to her, she stilled. Cam, she said, your arm, it did hurt? She thought perhaps he had not heard, even though Mam glanced up sharply, because Cam only looked over her head. Then Mam said, What did they do, those boys? Pin forgot her question, for Hugo and Edward were daring each other to eat a snail. They stood nose to nose, each holding one ready. Hugo ate anything. He had eaten grass, tadpoles, fish eyes for dares. He opened his mouth and went chomp. Edward dropped his snail down the back of Hugo's shirt. Hugo yelled, fished the snail out, and came up to Pin. Yum, yum! Pin screamed and ran, Hugo right behind her, until she cried. Bed for you, my maid, said Ma'am. She tried to hug Pin good night, but Pin wriggled free. Da walked her back to the cottage. He stopped to show her the pictures in the stars. There's the arrow, can you see it? Shooting its way to the warrior, there. Pin could not see the star pictures, but she so liked this quiet time with Da that she nodded and looked where he pointed. Cam, said Da, you mustn't mind him. Pin didn't mind him, not one bit. It is different for him. He was the only child we had. Ha! Thought we'd never have another, but every year your ma'am she gave to the goddess, and the goddess heard her at last, for the twins came along. Then you, the surprise baby, and a girl to boot, coming 3 years after the twins. Well, he on his own all the time, it was different for him. And then, what happens but he ups and leaves us for the war? He's come back not whole, not our Cam. What can we do with him, eh? Do you see? Pin nodded, though she did not see. In bed, she thought about the stars, healing in the black wheel of the sky, and dreamed of them, and a dress of green lettuce, and the new Lord of Dornlanet's snails. Next time we read about Graceful Fenister. Isn't that a great name? Alright, I hope you enjoyed the first chapter of The Returning. See you again next week. Have a great weekend. Bye!